Okay, so getting right into it, we're tackling the Gaza Strip evacuations
Right.
today, and let me tell you, this Wikipedia article you've brought, it's
Oh, it's a lot.
it's dense to say the least.
Massive.
Over 1 million people displaced. It's
Yeah.
just hard to even wrap my head around that
Yeah, and it's been framed. I mean, the article calls it the second Nakba,
right away.
which is a loaded term, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about, obviously referencing the 1948 Palestinian exodus.
Right.
But using that term, it really speaks to just this deep sense of, historical trauma and the weight of history on this situation.
And to think, it's like, I mean, it all started with that initial 24-hour evacuation order
Right.
back in October 2023 for northern Gaza.
It's
And like reading through this, it just seems like the opposite of, I mean, this was not like some carefully planned,
Right.
relocation.
Mhm.
And the fact that the UN even called it unsafe
yeah.
and unrealistic.
And who?
Who defines safe in a war zone?
Right.
I mean, that's like, kind of one of the big questions.
Yeah.
I mean, the article describes families fleeing with like, white flags,
Yeah.
passing Israeli tanks. It's just,
It's such a powerful image.
it is. It is.
Mhm.
It speaks to like the power imbalances and just like the desperate
Yeah.
choices people were forced to make.
And then you read about like the abandoned babies, at Al Nasser Hospital.
Yeah.
And it's just like that detail, I don't know why, but it's just like, heartbreaking.
It's horrifying. And then you layer on top of that, you talk about these attacks on hospitals, like Ali Arab Hospital. I mean, these are not just like accidental casualties of war. This seems like, at least according to the article, there was a deliberate strategy at play here.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you've got people who are being told, who are, sick and wounded, who are being given these impossible orders to evacuate.
It begs the question, right? Was this chaos or was this something much more intentional?
Yeah, yeah. And the article quotes Him Kaderi, a Gazan journalist,
Mhm.
and she compares the evacuations to the Trail of Tears.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And she talks about bombed cars
Yeah.
and just bodies in the street and just the panic. I mean, it's just,
Yeah,
it's really chilling.
It is. It reminds us that these aren't just numbers we're talking about.
Right.
These are real people, with real lives and real families who are being uprooted. And, the psychological impact of this is huge.
Yeah.
I mean, to live under that kind of threat.
Absolutely.
Where you never know if your home is going to be safe one day to the next. I mean, it's going to take a toll.
And even when, there was that ceasefire and people tried to return north,
Right.
they were met with gunfire.
Yeah.
It's just like, it just doesn't.
Which again begs the question of like, how safe, how viable were these evacuations really?
Yeah.
I mean, because that paints a very different picture than, maybe what the IDF was claiming.
Right. And the article talks about Al-Mawasi,
Right.
which was supposed to be this safe zone. And it sounds like it was just,
Overcrowded shelters,
yeah,
lack of resources,
yeah,
constant fear of bombardment.
yeah,
Despite these assurances from the IDF, it seems like it was anything but safe.
right.
And the article mentions that, some Gazans just stopped complying with the evacuation orders altogether because it's like, where do you go?
Where do you go? Exactly.
Where do you go when nowhere is safe? And what does that do? I mean,
Right.
what does that do to a population long term when you feel like you can't even trust,
Right,
the powers that be to keep you safe?
right.
It really makes you think about, what are the psychological ramifications of this kind of displacement?
And it's not even just like the displacement itself, right? It's like the article mentions ethnic cleansing.
Yeah.
And, I mean, talk about a term with some baggage.
Right, and it's a term, I mean, it's highly contested in
Right.
terms of, like, what it actually means. Because there's no, like, universally agreed upon definition.
Right.
But broadly, we're talking about the forced removal of a specific ethnic or religious group, from a territory.
Right.
And often, the idea behind it is, to create a homogenous society.
Right. And so like tying that back to, you've got that direct line to the first Nakba in 48.
Right.
It's like almost like history's repeating itself.
And I think that's where, calling it the second Nakba is just, it adds, another like layer of kind of, I don't know, I hesitate to say significance, but it really highlights the potential long-term
Right. Because it's like
consequences of this.
invoking that for Palestinians, that's like a deeply ingrained
Exactly.
trauma. And to say it's happening again.
And it's interesting, too, because even some of the article mentions, Israeli politicians using the term Nakba.
Right, which is just like, I don't know.
Right. Which, again, speaks to the power of that term, right?
Yeah, it's very intentional.
Yeah.
It's almost like a warning.
It begs the question, right? What are the motivations here? What is the ultimate goal?
Yeah. And what about, like, the global response? I mean, it sounds like the world is kind of watching this happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's a mixed bag, right? I mean, you've got condemnation from countries like Egypt. They called it a systematic policy to displace Palestinians.
Right.
And then you've got, and this is interesting, right? This leaked U.S. memo urging Israel to, change its approach to these evacuations.
Which is interesting because, U.S., Israel, they're pretty tight usually.
Yeah.
So that says something, I think.
Right. It suggests some level of concern.
Yeah.
Even if it's not necessarily translating to, concrete action on a larger scale.
Right.
But, yeah, it's definitely something to pay attention to.
And it's not even just, outside pressure. It's within Israel, there are different viewpoints on this.
Oh, absolutely. It's not a monolithic perspective at all. You've got some Israeli politicians who are very openly calling for Palestinian immigration.
Right.
And then you have others who are condemning this as inhumane.
Right.
So it adds another layer of complexity to an already incredibly, sensitive and volatile situation.
It's no easy answers here, just a whole lot of questions.
Yeah.
The article mentions war crimes being leveled against Israel with relation to these evacuations.
Yeah.
What are we talking about specifically?
So some of the accusations include, forced displacement of civilians, attacks on those designated safe zones like Amawasi that we talked about, denial of humanitarian aid.
Right. And these aren't theoretical violations.
Right. These are considered, under international law, these are serious violations.
Yeah. And it even mentions South Africa's pursuing a genocide case.
Right, which is
against Israel.
That's a big deal.
At the International Court of Justice.
Yeah.
And they're citing these evacuations.
Yeah, and that's something that I think, bears watching, right? I mean, to see how that case unfolds.
Because that's not just an op-ed.
Right. Yeah.
That's actual legal ramifications potentially.
It demonstrates the seriousness of these allegations.
Right. Wow.
And really, it makes you think about the long-term consequences of this.
Right. Because this article is, it does a good job, but it focuses a lot on, the immediate impact.
What happens?
But what happens next?
Yeah.
Where do these people go from here?
Yeah. And that's the question that lingers for me. The article kind of leaves us with this picture of a people in limbo, stripped of their homes, stripped of their sense of security. It's hard to imagine the psychological toll that this is going to take on generations to come.
And their homes, their land, is that it? Are they never going to be allowed back?
And that's, I think, the fear, right?
Yeah.
And that uncertainty, that lack of control just adds another layer of trauma to an already just devastating situation.
Wow. I don't know. It's just reading this whole thing, I just keep coming back to why?
Right.
What is what's the end game here? What is Israel hoping to accomplish?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And I think, the article does a good job of presenting different viewpoints.
Right.
There's even within Israel, there doesn't seem to be a clear consensus on what the objective is.
Right.
Some people are arguing, it's a security issue. Some are saying it's demographics.
Right.
Some are even suggesting this is part of a long-term strategy to kind of push for, Palestinian immigration.
Right.
Here.
Which, going back to what we were talking about, that's...
Right, which then leads to these
ethnic cleansing.
Accusations of ethnic cleansing. Right. And then, I think when you start talking about the potential consequences of a strategy like that, it's a powder peg.
Yeah.
And this just adds fuel to the fire.
And then, zoom out even further, right? It's this isn't just, some contained thing.
Oh, absolutely not.
This has implications for everybody.
And I think that's why, it's so important to understand, the nuances here.
Right.
Because it's easy to get caught up in the headlines, right? And the political rhetoric and lose sight of
the
human cost, right?
Yeah. And the article does a good job, I think, of giving some of those personal stories, It's the fear and the...
But we have to remember that those are just a glimpse, into this much larger ongoing tragedy.
Yeah, and that behind all these numbers and everything,
yes,
these are
real people, real lives
with real lives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The article mentions like families that have been displaced multiple times already.
Right.
Just imagine that.
The psychological toll
Yeah.
of having your life uprooted over and over again.
It's unfathomable. And where do they go from here, you know?
And that's I mean...
The article doesn't really have the answer.
It doesn't. And I think that's what's so,
Right.
It's both... I don't know, I find it both fascinating and terrifying, right?
Yeah.
Because it really is a future that's like still being written.
Yeah.
The outcome is not by any means certain.
So many questions like, will there be accountability?
Right.
Will these people be able to go home?
Will the international community actually find the will to, create some kind of lasting peace?
Those are questions
that are going to last long after we're done with this article.
Absolutely.
Way beyond.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. This isn't just some history thing that happens.
It's an ongoing trust.
It's happening right now.
With very real implications.
And I think, for anyone listening, you can't just be a bystander on this, right? Like, you got to
stay informed,
stay engaged.
Engage in dialogue.
Yeah, and demand better, right? Demand a just and peaceful resolution for everyone involved.
We can't let the complexity of it kind of paralyze us into inaction, right?
Right.
The human cost is too high.
Couldn't agree more.
And the stakes are way too great.